Green Day is one of the biggest rock bands in the world. So big, in fact, that they basically need no introduction. Since forming in the late 80s in the East Bay area of California, Billy Joe Armstrong, Mike Dirnt, and Trey Cool have been at it for a long time. Love them or hate them, there is no doubt that they are one of the most commercially successful punk rock bands in the history of music. That even if you're not much of a rock person, let alone a music person, you know this band. Almost a year ago, I made a video talking about their 1994 album Dookie, and why I consider it to be my favorite album of all time. To keep you all up to speed, I said that it was a fun pop-punk album that spearheaded a sea change in the rock music landscape of its time, and that it was a special album that reminded us how important nostalgia can be in our lives, all while also reminding us that sometimes we shouldn't be taking life so seriously. To my surprise, that video did really well, which left me dying to make another video talking about how special this band's music is to my life. I want to reiterate that Green Day is my favorite band ever, and as much as I want to review every single album in their discography one by one, I don't really have the time to review them all in great detail. And then one day, while listening to their new album Saviors, I had this brilliant idea circling around my head. What if I can review them all in one single video? And that's what this video aims to do, sharing my thoughts on every single Green Day studio album, Gauntlet style. Now, keep in mind that I am not counting live albums, compilation albums, or that one demo record they did for the trilogy. I'll only be reviewing the main albums in their discography, which means that if you're watching this video just to hear my thoughts on shenanigans or their side projects, then you come to the wrong place. I've also decided not to rank every album from worst to best, to make it stand out a little from the other videos talking about Green Day's discography, and instead talk about every single one of these albums in chronological order, from their debut all the way to their recent album as of this video's release, Saviors. Oh man. I have a lot to say about that one. So, if you have the time to listen to me whine, and you don't want to be an American idiot or whatever, then here's my thoughts on all 14 Green Day albums as of this video's upload. Nothing screams we all start somewhere more than the band's 1990 debut album, 39 Smooth. Barely anyone's ever heard of this album, and that's maybe because it's been out of print for the longest time, and the only official way to listen to this album is through a compilation of the band's early works. It's a very interesting listen if you've been a fan of this band for a long time like I am, coming off like a time capsule representing the band's early years as a major part of the Bay Area punk scene. It's raw and fast, almost to the point where it's reminiscent of the Ramones' first few records, and the entire album is pretty short and sweet, even if it hasn't really stood the test of time compared to the other great punk rock records by bands like The Descendants or the Buzzcocks. I also think the drums on this record aren't really all that great in retrospect, since they tend to sound all over the place, and that probably explains why John Kiffmeyer didn't get to stay very long as the band's drummer. I do think it's funny to imagine that an alternate universe exists where Trey Cool never joined the band and John never got replaced, and he did the drums for some of the band's biggest albums to date. It would be insane. That's for sure. I guess if there's one thing going for it, it's that this album has a very youthful energy to it, found in songs like At the Library or 16, or my personal favorite track off this album, Going to Pasalacqua. I hope I pronounced it properly. Overall, not a bad start for one of the biggest rock bands of all time, but at the same time, I kind of feel like it pales in comparison to the band's sophomore album. Kerplunk is one of the most successful independent albums of all time, as I mentioned in my Dookie review. It's the band's first album to feature longtime drummer Trey Cool, and the last to be released independently. What I like about this album is how it builds upon everything the band set up in their previous record, with more refined songs, crisper production, as well as the inclusion of the greatest song in the band's entire discography, Dominated Love Slave.
I love feeling dirty. I love feeling cheap. I love it when you hurt me. So drive the staples deep.
It's beautiful. If there's one song I want played the most at my funeral, then this is it. This is the one. Jokes aside, I see Kerplunk as the pinnacle of the band's Gilman days, featuring songs that deal with all kinds of different things like the cute 2000 Light Years Away, or the unholy hybrid of dark humor and puppy love in 80. You also have songs like Christy Road and Who Wrote Holden Caulfield that would forecast the slacker rock direction the band would expand upon in their next album, Dookie. And then you have the extremely underrated, relatable, and heart-wrenching ballad, No One Knows. Not the Queens of the Stone Age song, by the way, I'm talking about the Green Day song. That, when you start to think about it, makes you feel like Green Day had a tendency of writing ambitious and theatrical songs like this from the very start. And last but not least, you have the original version of Welcome to Paradise that accurately represents the band's DIY punk rock club days versus the studio-recorded Dookie version. That's such a massive improvement on all fronts that the Kerplunk version sounds like a demo in retrospect. So yeah, it's a massively underrated record, and one that every Green Day fan has to listen to at least once to get the full picture as to how the band sounded before their big break with Dookie. Released in 1994, Dookie is the band's breakthrough major label album that pretty much changed rock music forever. And what else can I say about this album that me and others haven't already said about it? It's just a damn fun album. So yeah, I've already talked about this album in a lot of detail, so I don't think I want to spend too much time praising this album any more than I already could. So if any of you guys want to hear what I have to say about this album and why I consider it to be my favorite album of all time, then you should go watch that video instead. With that said, I'm gonna take this opportunity to add a couple of extra things that I wasn't able to mention in that video. To start, the band just dropped a 30th anniversary reissue of this album very recently, packed to the brim with demos and the entirety of their performance in Woodstock 94. And yes, it includes audio of the mud fight that happened at the end of their setlist, which is such a Green Day thing to do when you're reissuing one of your biggest albums to date. Several outtakes are on here as well, including a studio version of Christy Road, which goes so hard, I'm shocked that it took us 30 plus years for this to get an official release. But then again, there was only room for one Kerplunk re-recording to make it on the album. Fun fact, both deluxe edition reissues of Dookie and Nimrod feature two different demo versions of the song When It's Time, a song that didn't even get an official release until the premiere of the American Idiot musical. And even then, that song only got released as a single exclusively in the United Kingdom, which is insane for a song that was written and re-recorded multiple times for 2 decades straight. They barely play that song in live shows too, and it's a damn shame because I personally think it's one of the sweetest songs the band's ever written. Yeah, I don't have much else to add here. This album is a work of art, and I've already said what I had to say about it. Moving on. Released just 1 year after the band broke onto the scene with Dookie, Insomniac proved to be uglier, harsher, and less fun, which probably explains why this album didn't really sell all that well when it first came out. Not that there aren't any bangers on this album like 86, or Walking Contradiction, or Stuck With Me, but re-listening to Insomniac, yeah, I can definitely say that it's not as accessible as its predecessor. If the first 2 tracks turn you off with its themes of extreme self-loathing and wishing your family would die so you could gain their inheritance money, then tap out now, because this album somehow gets even more fucked up from there on out, with songs like the Ode to Meth Addiction, Geek Stink Breath, and Panic Song, which is about, well, take a guess. I also really like how the production in this one is not as clean as Dookie's. It's grungier and filthier and a lot more raw, which I think helped to strengthen the band's aggression found all throughout this album. But as much as it'd be cool to say that this album is to Dookie what In Utero is to Nevermind, that'd be a bit of an overstatement. Insomniac has some flaws. For instance, I admire how the album is a lot heavier in terms of sound and lyrical content than their previous albums, especially considering that this was right when the band had to come to grips with the consequences of becoming famous. But I feel like it's at the cost of everything that made Dookie so fun to listen to in the first place. And because of that, the album can feel pretty joyless at times, with songs like No Pride and Armitage Shanks making this album feel a bit too nihilistic for its own good. It's no downward spiral, that's for sure. But on the contrary, you also have songs like Brain Stew, which makes up for its simplicity by being one of the bleakest hits in Green Day's entire discography, before it all comes crashing down with Jaded, that sounds like the musical equivalent to a mosh pit gone violent. So while I don't look at Insomniac as fondly as the rest of their 90s output, I still think this album deserves much more love for being one of the darkest and most personal albums in the band's discography.
I was a young boy that had big plans. Now I'm just another shitty old man.
Next up on the list is the band's 1997 album, Nimrod. It's good to know Green Day named an album after David Zaslav. This album feels like a bit of a return to form after the harshness of the last album, with cleaner production and more melodic tracks like Scattered and Worry Rock, all while building on the sarcastic humor and the fuck all of you attitude that the band had on their previous two albums. To the point where you have stuff like Platypus and Prosthetic Head and Billy Joe literally screaming his lungs out on Take Back. Take! Take! In which the band makes it clear that they love being haters. I mean, what can I say? Thriving off negativity really does a lot to a motherfucker. Nimrod is also a lot more adventurous than their other albums, with the band incorporating elements of ska, rock and roll, surf rock, and folk, as well as the inclusion of instruments you'd least expect a punk rock band to have in their songs, like the harmonica and strings. And this was before Yellowcard broke onto the scene with a frickin' violinist, by the way. But Nimrod's energy remains just as sardonic and aggressive as ever, especially on the big hits like the bluesy Hitchin' a Ride, the Beck levels of irony on Nice Guys Finish Last, and the bittersweet sounding Redundant, which is genuinely one of my favorite Green Day songs ever. And lastly, you can't talk about this album without giving a nod to Good Riddance, Time of Your Life, which is still one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking singles in the band's entire catalog, even if it's been overplayed in graduation ceremonies and weddings for 27 years straight. Who can blame them though? It's a good song. A great song, in fact. This was basically the glimpse of us of the 90s. And while I'm on the topic of comparing this album to recent stuff, the best way I can describe this album is that it's like the 90s version of Olivia Rodrigo's Guts. Sonically, it's a lot more expansive and colorful than its predecessor, but retains the relatable teenage angst that made the previous stuff a lot of fun and builds on it with lots of bangers. All in all, a bit of an improvement over Insomniac in my opinion, and an album that's fun as it is chaotic. And before you ask, yes, I know, it's underrated. Oh my god, Warning is the most underrated Green Day album. Did you know that? No one's ever heard of this album. Have you even heard of this album before? But here's the thing though, is an album still underrated when it's become overrated to talk about how underrated it is? Think about that. Although to be fair, it's understandable why one would call 2000's Warning the most underrated album in the band's catalog, since it barely sold a lot of copies and proved to be the band's lowest commercial point since signing to a major label. I guess people were really into that new metal shit by that point, huh? This album has garnered a lot of newfound love and appreciation from fans over the years, which I think you can attribute to just how offbeat and soft this album sounds compared to everything else in their discography. For those of you who don't know, this album's somewhat notorious for the band's decision to slightly move away from their angsty and in-your-face pop-punk sound, and instead go for a mellower folk-punk sound on this album, reminiscent of Bob Dylan and Billy Bragg. And sure, you may think it's boring, you may think it's dull and lifeless, and you may even assume that the band only decided to go acoustic just because Good Riddance was so successful. But then again, you have to at least admit that this is not the most baffling change in sound that Green Day's ever done. And besides, I personally really admire the folk-punk sound they went for on this album. I'd even argue that this was a step in the right direction for the band. Songs like the title track and Minority do a really good job keeping the band's punk rock spirit intact, all while opening plenty of room for experimentation like the Strokes-ish bluesy ode to BDSM, Blood, Sex, and Booze, which funny enough was a better take on garage rock than whatever the fuck Green Day did on Dose or Father of All, or the theatricalities of Misery, whose lyrics read out like a song off Taylor Swift's Folklore, written by the Coen brothers. You also have cute songs like Church on Sunday and Waiting, and the anti-consumerist acoustic ballad Macy's Day Parade, which is easily one of the most heart-wrenching album enders the band's ever recorded. I cry every time that song's on. Still not as tragic as the 1997 Macy's Day Parade, though. So even if the word underrated gets thrown around this album a lot, I really do think Warning rightfully deserves to be called as such, and I can only hope that more people will come to appreciate it for showcasing a more mature side of the band for many more years to come. Now, this next album is what Sid from Toy Story would call the big one. American Idiot. Green Day rockin' against Bush. What more could you ever ask for? A lot, as it turns out. I'm not going to add a lot to this, since I plan to make a Why I Love on this album very soon, so here's a summary of my thoughts on this album instead. Dookie's better. I don't know about you, but it just is. Don't get me wrong, this album still kicks ass, but I just think it lacks the same punch Dookie had. That's just me though, and everyone watching my videos should stay entitled to their own opinions. Like, who do you think I am? Anthony Fantano? Come on now, the man put this album on the C tier, right next to the fucking trilogy. He should have the death sentence for that opinion alone. I do need to talk about my thoughts on this album a little bit though, since after all, you did click on this video wanting to hear my thoughts on every Green Day album ever. Did you honestly think that I wasn't going to say anything about the biggest milestone in the band's career? Come on now. I'm not exactly sure if there's anything to say about the hit singles off this album that haven't been said yet. I mean, they're literally some of the most iconic songs in the band's catalog. The uproarious, rapid-fire takedown of the American media in the title track, the catchy and upbeat massive middle finger to George Bush, Holiday, and the grandiose 9-minute epics of Jesus of Suburbia and Homecoming, the latter of which features these amazing vocal passages from Mike and Trey. And who could ever possibly forget the biggest hit to come out of this album, Boulevard of Broken Dreams, which was essentially the national anthem for emo kids in the 2000s before the Black Parade came out. And as much as I thoroughly enjoy this album as much as the next guy, I can't help but have this sinking feeling in my gut that this album can easily steer towards being too theatrical and over-ambitious and over-dramatic for its own good, or as I like to call it, Shizuku-core, especially when you consider the fact that I don't look at theater kids all that kindly, to say the least. Thankfully, this album doesn't go far too deep into that territory, thanks in part to some of the most beautiful songs the band's ever recorded. Like, come on, if you hate Wake Me Up When September Ends, then you're probably a horrible garbage person. That song is literally about the death of Billy's father, for crying out loud. And I'm gonna leave it at that. I want to save all of my thoughts on this album for a later time, because again, I have a lot to say about American Idiot. So until then, here's the Leela say you're doing goofy shit.
オープニング主題歌、エンディング主題歌の初回生産分に配信視聴シリアルが封入されていますので、まだ話聞いたけど見れてないですという方はぜひこの機会に見ていただけるととっても嬉しいです。
This is literally just a boneless American Idiot. No, seriously, if you didn't like how ambitious and theatrical American Idiot was, then definitely don't listen to this album, because this one really cranks them up to 11. Actually, saying that it cranks them up to 11 is an understatement. It cranks them up to 25. As a result, you have yourself an album that can sometimes be a little too far up its own ass, with even more ballads than a Rod Stewart album full of U2 covers. That's not to say the ballads on this thing suck. Some of them are beautiful as they are anthemic. Viva La Gloria, 21 Guns, Last Night on Earth, and the title track are just a few examples. It's also the cleanest sounding Green Day album to date, thanks in part to legendary Nirvana collaborator Butch Vig handling production instead of Rob Cavallo. There's also a lot of clear influences on this album, ranging from old and new, like The Who, The Beatles, Queen, and Muse. So yeah, you can tell that Green Day was clearly trying to make this the biggest, boldest album they've ever done, that it kind of ends up collapsing under its own weight. Like, for example, what's with the weird-ass laughs in Christian's Inferno? Is Billy Joe trying to tell us that we live in a society or something? There's also a passage in Horseshoes and Hand Grenades where Billy's doing this, like, weird and distorted vocal passage where he's going, ah, 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 ah. They also try to recapture the magic of Homecoming from the last album with American Eulogy, but with mixed results. Also, Mike Thurn just kind of phoning in his verse going, I don't wanna live in a modern world, I don't wanna live in a modern world. And also Billy Joe dropping the hard R N-word. Yeah. I mean, I get the point that he was trying to make with that lyric, but yeah, Billy Joe's no Kendrick Lamar. On that note, yes, despite the political themes sprinkled all throughout this album in songs like East Jesus Nowhere, they're somehow even less apparent here than in American Idiot. I guess Billy Joe's more interested in flexing his Wattpad tier love story writing than dunking on the Bush administration at this point. And also, this album ends in the most underwhelming way possible. For an album that wants to be as big as this, you'd think you'd be able to stick the landing with something other than a closer as bland as See the Light. At least What's-Her-Name had a lot of passion and emotion and fire to it compared to this. And that's how I see 21st Century Breakdown in a nutshell. It has the vibes of a sequel that tries to be bigger and bolder, giving you more of the stuff you loved the first time around, but ultimately ends up just being an inferior repeat of the original. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag. But hey, who knows? Maybe you'll appreciate it more with further re-listens down the road. But yeah, as it stands right now, A lot of people consider Uno Dos Tre to be some of the band's worst albums in their entire discography, and after listening to them in full for the first time, I can definitely see why. These albums blow. Except Tre, that one's actually kind of okay. Uno feels like a Weezer album but with less fun or charisma. Even Make Believe sounds more interesting than this. While I admire the band's attempts to make an album that's not as political or as ambitious as their last two rock operas, it still doesn't help the fact that so many songs on this album sound so safe and generic. They feel like Green Day doing a cover band album of themselves. Because after the nonsensical but fun opening track, Nuclear Family, it's all downhill from there. And I don't just mean this album in itself, but also this trilogy as a whole. But while Uno is a bit of a snoozer, at least it's not those. By the time I got to Billy Joe singing, "Oh baby, baby, it's fuck time," I thought to myself, there's no way things could get any worse from here, right? And then I heard Nightlife.
I'll be the devil on your shoulder saying, hey boy, come over, my black heart beats. Crimson Clover. So operator, patch your boy in. This is Nightlife and I'll get under your skin.
Ghost is such a repulsive and tacky album to listen to that I genuinely think it's the band's worst album by a long shot. And what pisses me off about this album even more is that Green Day does know how to make a good garage rock throwback album. The Foxborough Hot Tubs and Longshot albums they did are incredibly underrated, and you can tell that they have a lot of passion and love for this old school rock and roll genre they're trying to emulate. But here, it just sounds like the band's only knowledge of garage rock are rock stars singing about sex and drugs. I feel like this album would have been better if Green Day paid homage to garage rock revival bands like The Strokes or the Black Keys, instead of singing lyrics like this. There's also an Amy Winehouse tribute song at the end, which is a nice change of pace, but I can't help but feel like it's just so oddly tacked onto there at the very end. I also think it's kind of funny that the best album in the entire trilogy is the one that barely sold 500,000 copies. Tre is the best album in the trilogy by default, simply because the songs on here actually feel like songs, instead of coming off like half-baked ideas or Billy Joe being horny. Whether we're talking about the bittersweetness of Brutal Love, or the full 6 minutes of Dirty Rotten Bastards, which is easily the best song in the entire trilogy by far. It still kind of suffers from the same issues I had with Uno, but to a lesser extent, which makes me feel like this is the one album in the trilogy that's filled with songs that the band were clearly passionate about. Yeah, it's a shame they saved the best for last, when it's pretty clear they should have dropped this one as Uno instead, so that it wouldn't be completely buried by 2 full albums of filler. You know how Eminem had to write a bunch of new songs for Encore because of a leak, but he was at the peak of his addiction, so he just ended up recording goofy shit that made it in the final cut? Uno Dos Tre is like the rock equivalent of that. Aside from a few songs from these 3 albums that I genuinely liked, you can kind of tell that Billy Joe was drunk as hell when he wrote and recorded a lot of the material in the trilogy. Add to the fact that promotion for these albums were absolutely chaotic, with the infamous iHeartRadio concert they did. Plus the production and instrumentation on these albums just feeling so weak in general. It's no wonder the band has mixed feelings about these albums looking back, and now they want to re-record this trilogy sometime soon, and hopefully with, better production. Yeah, not even Rob Cavallo could save this godforsaken trilogy from being such a mess, unfortunately. Anyways, yeah, this trilogy's not good. Next. Revolution Radio, operational control on the headline. My love's bulletproof. Yeah. Yeah, this album's pretty good. 2016's Revolution Radio was a much-deserved return to form after whatever the hell the trilogy was. My personal favorites include the emotional cuts like Somewhere Now, Still Breathing, Outlaws, and Forever Now that really make you wonder if this album was supposed to be a rock opera too. Plus songs like the title track and Bang Bang that remain some of the band's most fiery singles to date. It's also one of the poppiest albums the band's ever made, especially given how clean the production sounds on this one. Not bad for an album that the band produced entirely by themselves, but it's not without its issues. Say Goodbye Youngblood in particular, yeah, these songs just do not work for me at all. Some of the lyrics on this album are also really weird. Okay, maybe not Blink-182 weird, but they still got me scratching my head, especially in songs like Too Dumb to Die. As much as I really love that song instrumentally, the lyrics on that one, yeah. Ugh. I also really admire the band's decision to return to a more political edge on the writing side of things, which makes the fact that this album came out just a few weeks before Trump won the elections 1,000 times funnier and more frightening than it should be. You can also tell from the live performances that the band cared a lot more about this album than they did with the trilogy, exchanging alcohol-induced rants about having 1 minute left in your setlist to chanting, "No Trump! No KKK! No Fascist USA!" Which I think the band should really bring back by now, considering what's been going on with the Republican primaries this year. I guess you can say that it's Jover. For real this time. I spent 2 weeks on this script. But despite its flaws, I still think Revolution Radio is a pretty decent album with some highlights. It starts and ends strong, but I think it definitely suffers somewhere in the middle point. Add to the fact that I just think this album hasn't really aged all that well sound-wise since it first came out. The cover art low-key goes hard, though, I'm not gonna lie. It's probably the best thing about this album looking back on it. No. Saviors is easily the band's best album in years. And while it isn't a 10 out of 10 album of the year masterpiece work of art or anything, it didn't need to be. What I love the most about this album is how it doesn't try to be as ambitious or out there as the band's previous works came to be. All it needed to do was sound like three guys just going into a studio and making good music together. And I think as a result of that, you have yourselves what's arguably the band's most normal album since Warning. Which is funny, because for everything normal about this album, Saviors also has a little bit of everything. The sonic experimentation of Nimrod and the trilogy, the sarcastic humor of Dookie and Insomniac, the theatricalities of their rock opera albums, the retro sound of Father of All, I mean this as a compliment by the way, the socio-political critiques of Revolution Radio, the mellow mood of Warning, the autobiographical lyrics of Kerplunk, and more. Or at least, that's how I see it anyways. For every fast song on this album that's energetic and fun to listen to, like 1981 and Look Man No Brains, there's also the slower ones that are more introspective and emotionally crushing, like Dilemma and Father to a Son. We also get Bobby Socks, which is Green Day's biggest LGBT anthem since the one they did on Dookie, and features these really unhinged vocals from Billy, who sounds like he's doing his best Chester Bennington impression. As well as Strange Days Are Here to Stay and The American Dream Is Killing Me, which see the return of political Green Day in its purest form. There's also songs on this album where Green Day works so well in sounds they've never done before, such as the lush, R.E.M.-esque jangle pop of Susie Chapstick, or the cheesy but cute 80s hair metal of Corvette Summer, which is the perfect song for carpool karaoke with a bunch of friends on a trip to Las Vegas or whatever. The production and mixing on this album don't get a lot of love, surprisingly enough. While the new Blink-182 and Foo Fighters albums are great and all, one of my biggest issues with those albums is that they either sounded too clean or over-compressed or both. So it's really refreshing to hear a modern rock album from a mainstream band that actually sounds like it has a bit of grit and rawness to it. thanks in no part to Rob Cavallo returning to produce this album. The album's not without its flaws though. Some of these songs tend to be playing it a little too safe, while others like One-Eyed Bastard only sound good just because they're pulled from other far better songs. These flaws almost seem like this album was made as a desperate apology for Father of All, but I think Saviors was able to do more than that, and on its own, it's still a really fun listen front to back. A return to form in every sense of the word, and then some. And there you go! Those are my thoughts on every Green Day album as of this video's upload. Some good, some bad, some mid. Even if I don't like every album the band's made, I still love Green Day enough to consider them my favorite rock band of all time, and maybe it's because of how far they've come since then. They're one of the few pop-punk bands who've been very successful in both the underground scene and the mainstream. Plus the fact that at the band's core, they're three best friends who've been making music for almost 40 years now, without ever backstabbing or publicly fighting each other. You can tell they're brothers in arms even with all the fame and accolades they've gotten, and they're very likely gonna stay that way until the sun blows out of the sky. Now if those don't sound like friendship goals, I don't know what will. Isn't that right, Penny? You see, this is what happens when you listen to a shitty album like Father of All in its entirety. You go mentally insane by the end and start believing that this random Penny over here is your best friend. Oh, what's that? You want to get Pizza Hut together? Oh, Penny, you're the sweetest. I gotta get out of this white void soon.
아니나?